Okay, we'll wait just a couple more minutes, see if anybody else comes rolling in. Remember that next week we start at 7 p.m. It is our last class. But I have 7th and 8th grade guitar players performing at 6. So we'll do that performance and then I will come for class. So we'll start at 7. We're going to be skipping around in the 19th century and in the 20th century. We're going to kind of hit the highlights of 19th century this week and 20th century next week. By no means is this a fully comprehensive overview of those 2 time periods, but we are out of time. So they can just get more done on campus than we can in one night. So tonight we'll be doing chapters 39, 40, 41, and 43. And then next week we will do something similar. 50, 55, 56, 58, and 62 next week, and that will wrap us up. So this week it's okay to go ahead and send your code word if you're watching the recording by Monday, but then our last week I will need that code word by Sunday because grades are due on Monday. So please get that in by Sunday so you can get credit for attendance. And we'll wait about 1 more minute. We will be starting with chapter 39. Oh, there's something under my fingernail. That's not attractive. Hi, Monica. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Alrighty, so here we are at the beginning, the early stages of the 19th century. Remember, we've just come out of the classical period with Beethoven being that bridge to the Romantic period, which is where we find ourselves now. This is Romantic with a capital R. Romantic, not necessarily lovey-dovey romantic, passionate, the heights of ecstasy and the depths of despair and everything in between. They want us to listen to Earl King, which we've actually heard before. If you remember back when we were talking about song form and did our vocabulary test, one of the songs we listened to was Earl King because it was a through composed song. Or through composed doesn't really come back and repeat anything. Everything's new from the beginning to the end of the song. Other forms that we find romantic song falling into are strophic and then modified strophic, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of in between strophic and through composed form. So we're going to talk about first the German art song, also called Lied. This was written for solo voice and piano, and we think this is what we think of when we think of classical art song. We think of Lieder. Composers wrote song cycles that unified a group of songs using poems by the same poet or thematically linked. 2 of the Romantic composers' favorite poets were Goethe and Heinrich Heine. Franz Schubert wrote more than 600 Lieder altogether, and 2 huge song cycles that are still performed every year all the time. Hi, Chloe. Earl King is a through composed Lied based on the Danish legend of the Elf King, as I'm sure you remember. We're not going to listen to that again because we've heard it. Robert Schumann wrote over 200 lieder. And he was inspired very much by his fiancée, who was an excellent piano player and a composer in her own right, Clara Wieck. And then they got married and she was Clara Wieck Schumann. One of Schumann's song cycles is A Poet's Love, Dichterliebe, which is a song cycle set to the poetry of Heinrich Heine, who we just mentioned. Schubert's hero worship was Beethoven. He practically worshipped at the feet of Beethoven. He wanted to be just like Beethoven. He was a fine piano player and an excellent composer, but he never found the critical or economic success that Beethoven found. Schumann probably would have gone on to write much more, but he had he was mentally unstable and eventually ended up in an asylum. His wife, Clara, was sort of looked after by another composer of this era, Johannes Brahms, who was really kind of in love with Clara, but Clara never really, thought of him that way. He was sort of the brother she never had, and really looked after the Schumanns after Robert was committed. So, art song, a song that is set to a high quality literary text. It is usually accompanied by piano and intended for concert performance. It's also called Lied, is German that's the German word for song, like aria is the Italian word for song. And if it's more than one, it's Lieder. These texts are in German. We're talking about vernacular here. This is not opera. It's going to be in the language of the country where it is performed and where it is composed. So in this case, this is German lieder, so all the texts are going to be in German. Important composers in this tradition were the aforementioned Franz Schubert and Robert Schumann and Johannes Brahms. And Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel, who was the sister of the composer Mendelssohn, and Clara Wieck Schumann, who we just mentioned, also wrote lieder. We mentioned Goethe and Heine being two of their favorite poets, and they were of the same school as Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, and Keats in England. They tended to write shorter, more lyric poems, often about nature and the beauty of nature, very dramatic, and that was something that Romantic composers were drawn to. If you wrote a set of lieder that say were all by Goethe, you could write a song cycle, because since all the texts were by Goethe, that would unify all those songs into the same cycle. Or you could write a set of lieder that were all about nature, but not necessarily all from the same poet, and then it would be unified because of the subject matter. You could unify song cycles in different ways. Another circumstance that made the art song popular was the fact that pianos were now the preferred household instrument in the 19th century. Pianos were kind of a new thing, very new for Mozart and new for Beethoven. Beethoven used to tear pianos to shreds because their soundboard, where the strings are connected, they weren't very strong yet. And Beethoven would play so forcefully that he would just rip them to shreds, and he would ruin pianos all the time. But now we're starting to figure out, oh, this kind of wood is much better and much stronger. This will last better and hold its tune better. So pianos became more widespread and more commonplace in wealthier and middle-class homes. So voice and piano together made sense, because if you had room in your house for a piano and someone could play it, then all you need is someone to sing the lieder, and poof, you've got instant music. We've talked before about strophic form, where every stanza is the same. And we talked before about through composed, where nothing is the same. It doesn't repeat anything. The modified strophic form is where a section may have a new key, rhythm, or varied melodic pattern, but it's still very similar to what had come before. So it's almost a theme and variations within the song itself. Franz Schubert was a songwriting prodigy. He's the one that wrote more than 600 lieder in a pretty short life. His songs were often performed in concert settings, but most of his career was built on intimate musical performances in friends' and sponsors' homes, or salons, as they were called, for which Schubert would write not only lieder, but dances and chamber works. He had a gift for writing melody, and his piano accompaniments are always good because he was an excellent piano player. He was born in Vienna and educated at the Imperial Chapel, where he sang in the choir, and that would later become the Vienna Boys Choir, which is still known all over the world. His father hoped that he would be a teacher, but Schubert fell in with a bunch of Bohemians, and they called themselves the Schubertiades in his honor, because he sort of became their leader, and he was the one that they all sort of looked up to because he was so talented. His friends said that everything he touched turned to song. We know that he wrote the Erl King, which we've heard before, and he wrote that when he was still a teenager, which is pretty impressive. This work catapulted him to public recognition and some fame, but he had a hard time getting his stuff published. He was often pressed for money, kind of like Mozart, and he sold his music for much less than it was really worth because he needed the money, he needed the cash. His later works include the song cycle Winter's Journey, and his dying wish at age 31, so he did not live very long, was to be buried near the master that he worshipped, Beethoven. And so his grave is very near Beethoven's grave. Schubert marks the confluence of the classical and romantic eras, sort of, again, like Beethoven. He bridges that gap between classicism and romanticism. His symphonies and chamber music are classical in their clear forms, and his songs are romantic. So in his larger works, he still has a foot in the classical realm of being very structured and following the rules. But in his songs, in his lieder, that he was much more free and much more in the romantic vein. Here you can see the list of some of his titles: Erl King, Die Forelle of the Trout, which is literally a song about a trout, and the song cycles, The Lovely Maid of the Mill, and Winter's Journey. He wrote 9 symphonies, again like Beethoven, including the Unfinished Symphony. He wrote chamber music, including quintets, string quartets, and piano trios, piano sonatas. He wrote 7 masses, and other choral music, operas, and incidental music. So to only be 31 when he died, he was a very busy person. He just wasn't very wealthy. We've already heard Erl King, so we're not going to listen to that. So let's talk about Schumann. Here's Robert Schumann. He was German by birth, and he was originally studying to be a lawyer. But his love for music wiped out his law career, and he decided he was going to become a piano player, and he was going to study with Frederick Wieck. That name sounds familiar. Frederick Wieck had a daughter named Clara. And Frederick Wieck was one of the foremost teachers of piano of his day. Schumann kind of ruined his own career because he tried to invent this contraction that would stretch his hand out so he could reach farther between intervals on the piano. And he damaged his hand. He did damage to the ligaments and to the nerves. And so when he was no longer really able to be a piano player because of this injury, he started composing instead. While he was still in his 20s, he created most of his important piano works. That's before he really hurt his hand. And then later on, his literary talent found expression through a publication he established, the New Journal of Music, So he became a composer and a writer about music, which was kind of a new thing. Robert carried on an intense courtship with the gifted pianist and composer Clara Wieck, who was the daughter of his teacher, Frederick. Frederick did not want them to marry because he didn't think Robert was going to amount to much. But finally, he gave in when Clara was 21 and Robert was 30, so there was a bit of an age gap there. They settled in Leipzig and started pursuing their careers side by side. But her devotion could not ward off Robert's increasing withdrawal from the world and auditory hallucinations. So in other words, Robert heard voices, and the voices told him to throw himself into the Rhine River, where he almost drowned and died. So after that happened, Clara had to put him in an asylum. Eventually his psychotic behavior turned into advanced dementia, and he died in 1956 at the age of 46. Remember that after he was put in the asylum and after he died, Clara and her children were sort of looked after by Johannes Brahms, who was their friend and really had a major crush on Clara. Schumann's music is imbued with impassioned melodies, novel changes of harmonies, driving rhythms that reveal him as a true romantic. He has 4 symphonies. Probably could have written more had he not had the mental instability that he did. He had a true romantic approach to harmony. He wasn't afraid of dissonance, and he wasn't afraid of not always resolving the dissonance. He let it stay crunchy. He often attached literary meanings to his piano music and was fond of cycles of short pieces connected by a literary theme or a musical motto, so like a song cycle. As Schubert had an affinity for the poetry of Goethe, Schumann preferred Heine. And Heinrich Heine's poems make up the song cycle A Poet's Love, Dichterliebe. So here is a list of his works, more than 200 lieder, some in song cycles, including Dichterliebe, orchestral music, 4 symphonies and a piano concerto, chamber music, including string quartets, piano trios, piano quintet, piano quartet, piano music including sonatas and numerous miniatures, 1 opera, choral music, and incidental music. So we're going to hear the first song in the cycle Dichterliebe called The Lovely Month of May. It has 2 strophes, which today we would call verses or stanzas. And the piano's introduction to the first strophe sets a wistful, rather joyous mood, and it seeks to evoke the fragility of new love. We might wonder if this lead is really about developing a new relationship, or rather expresses the longing and desire of a lost or unrequited love. Oh my, this is so attuned to the romantic sensibilities that it's almost quintessential. It's almost iconic, as we would say today. So let's hear some of Dichterliebe. And let's hear it on here because I like this better. Sorry, I was scrolling before and I put myself out of focus. Okay. So this is for tenor and piano. The piano is almost like a duet voice to the singer. It's so delicate. It's like the shimmer of dew on grass to me. The light kind of shines through it because it's not these big heavy chords. It's chordal, but those chords are broken up into an arpeggiation. They're separated into their separate notes, and it makes it sound really light. It's beautiful stuff. Okay, we're gonna cruise right through this and go on to chapter 40. So now we come back to our side of the pond, and we're going to talk about what's going on in the United States at this time. Stephen Foster was one of the most successful in terms of music publishing and in terms of getting his name on copies of music, songwriters of maybe of all time. Stephen Foster wrote parlor songs, which are akin to Lied in German, in Germany, but of course, since Stephen Foster is American, they're going to be in English. And his songs were often popularized through minstrel shows, which was a racially charged theatrical variety show. Performers often would put on blackface, which is really frowned upon today, but at the time was considered, you know, funny. It's not really that funny. And they would be caricatures of African-American people, and they would make fun of African-American people by their actions and the songs that they sang. Stephen Foster, here is a poster for a minstrel show. If you look carefully, you can probably tell that these gentlemen are not, in fact, black. They are wearing blackface. And they're wearing, you know, these big floppy shoes and these plaid pants so that they look kind of silly. They act silly. They're making fun of people. So Stephen Foster's music was often used in minstrel and variety shows because it's catchy. It's catchy, and it's really woven into the fabric of the United States and our musical heritage. It's sad that we have to remember it for being part of minstrelry, but such it is. This is the truth. Stephen Foster blended folk songs, almost things that almost sound like folk songs, but are really composed, and creates the parlor song. A song generally accompanied by piano intended for home entertainment. The term is particular to 19th century America. We don't really have parlor songs anymore. Today we have popular music, but at the time this was the popular music. And you couldn't hear it, you know, on the radio or buy CDs of it or download it from Amazon because those things hadn't happened yet. The way that your music became popularized was by public performance and by publishing so people could buy it and perform it in their own homes. Many of Foster's titles are very common to us today. They're recognizable, like Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair. That is one of his most nostalgic songs. He also wrote Old Folks at Home. He wrote Oh Susanna. That I will probably get the full list here in just a few minutes, but many of his songs feel like folk songs to us now because they're so ingrained in our musical heritage and memory, but they're in fact composed. They're not true folk songs. Let's talk about minstrelry, which is hard to say. Minstrelry is a late 19th century American entertainment featuring white performers in blackface, acting out stereotypes of African-American slaves. So again, it's played for laughs. There's really absolutely nothing funny about slavery, but at the time, we weren't that far removed, or we were right in the middle of that time. It's jarring for modern audiences to think about because it's so explicitly racist. And we can recognize that now, where at the time, it wasn't seen as such. The shows featured white performers in blackface, acting out idealized scenes from the plantation. And that was vastly different from what it was really like to be an enslaved person. Minstrelsy is one of the first traditions that revealed white Americans' fascination with and misunderstanding of African Americans. And because of its widespread popularity in the 1800s, it shaped stereotyping of African American culture well into the 20th century. Several U.S. college alma mater songs originally arose out of white students' amateur minstrel performances. Every college has a fight song, and some of them come down from, some of those tunes come down from this time. Another well-known Foster song is Camptown Races, in which a slave sings of having a wonderful time betting on horses. I bet the slave really doesn't have any money to bet. And he also wrote Old Folks at Home, that starts way down upon the Swanee River. You may have heard that at some point, even if you've only heard the tune. Foster himself was ostensibly sympathetic toward the abolitionist cause, so he was not a fan of slavery. And he claimed that he wanted his plantation songs to inspire compassion for the plight of those who were enslaved. Ultimately, he earned most of his income from these minstrel songs. So, it's kind of a put up or shut up kind of thing. But at the time, it was not frowned upon. Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair was written in 1853 to 1854, just after the composer had separated from his wife. And her name was Jane Denny McDowell. The tone is bittersweet because he's thinking about, better days that they had together, and it sounds very much like a folk song. I think we're going to hear Jeannie here. Let me double check, make sure. Yeah, we are. Okay. Although Foster did not spend that much time in the South, which is amazing because most of his music is written about the South and life in the South and Southern culture, but he was from Ohio. So, he never really spent that much time in the South. It's thought that My Old Kentucky Home, which is another one of his songs, which is the state song of Kentucky, was actually inspired by Harriet Beecher Stowe's anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So you see how interwoven all of these different threads of culture are. He read Uncle Tom's Cabin and it inspired My Old Kentucky Home. Foster was perhaps the first American to actually make a living as a professional songwriter. The composers in this era made little profit from their publications. Foster moved to New York, where he wrote his famous song, Beautiful Dreamer, which is one of my favorites of his, conceived in the style of an Italian aria. He died in New York at 37. He was a penniless alcoholic and a victim to a fall in a cheap New York hotel. He fell and hit his head and just really kind of never got up again. Today, Foster's songs are better known than he is. And again, they kind of feel like folk songs to us because we're so attuned to them. So let's hear Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair. B section.
With the light,
So the accompaniment underneath that melody is very chordal, not as romantic in construction as what we heard on the Schumann. That would also make it easier as an amateur piano player to perform in your own home. It would be much easier to play that than to play the Schumann. And remember, Foster was writing to try to sell copies of music, so that makes sense that he would want his piano accompaniments to be something that you could master with some practice and not be too out of reach. Now we come to one of my particular favorite romantic composers, Frédéric Chopin. Frédéric Chopin was a Polish composer, but he did most of his important work in Paris. In fact, his body is buried in Paris, but his heart is buried in Poland, which is a whole other story. Chopin's works include etudes, which are basically a teaching piece, a piece to highlight a particular skill or a particular thing that needs to be worked on and learned and mastered. And he would write these beautiful etudes so that you could, learn how to jump the sixth or whatever. He wrote nocturnes, which are not pieces about nighttime, preludes, which are meant to come before, dances, including Polish mazurkas and polonaise, as well as sonatas and concertos for pianos. His music calls for the use of rubato or robbed time, where you break out of the beat pattern, you break out of the tempo, and you deliberately kind of stretch things out. I always tell my especially my younger students, rubato is like when you get out of bed in the morning and you go, oh, and you stretch, and that stretch is what rubato feels like when you're playing it or you're performing it. It kind of stretches everything out and then it snaps back in to the original tempo. By the way, rubato is your code word this week. If you are watching this later on, be sure that you send me rubato as your code word. We're going to hear the Revolutionary Etude. Remember, an etude is a teaching piece, which is one of his most popular works, highly emotional, and has been linked to the composer's distress over his native Poland's war with Russia. Remember, this was a time period where there was a lot of upheaval, lots of wars, especially on the European continent. And of course, we are going to fight a civil war right here in America. So there was a lot of upheaval. And if you were a Polish composer based in Paris and you heard that your homeland was going to war with Russia, you're going to have some deep feelings about that. And one of the ways that Chopin expressed those deep feelings was by being a nationalistic composer. He was not the only person who used folk music and dances from his native land, even though he was living somewhere else, and created musical works based on that folk music or those native dances. That was nationalism, and it was a very big thing in the Romantic period. The rise of the popularity of the piano helped shape the musical culture of the Romantic era. Remember, it was much more common to have a piano in the home now than it had been before. It proved especially attractive to amateurs because melody and harmony could be performed on one instrument where they couldn't on strings or winds. So you could play the piano and you get the harmony, usually in the left hand, and the melody, usually in the right hand, all at the same time. And that was nice because you could hear the whole experience with just one instrument in the home. The piano thus played a crucial role in the taste and experience of the new mass public. This is a painting of Chopin at the piano. This could be George Sand watching him play, probably not. And so it was important that people who wanted to make a name for themselves as a piano player were pretty virtuosic. At first, performers and composers were the same person. Mozart and Beethoven introduced their own piano concertos to the public. They were the soloists. They were the person at the keyboard. But now a class of virtuoso performers began to arise whose only job was to dazzle audiences by playing music that was composed by someone else. The 19th century saw a series of crucial technical improvements that led to the development of the modern grand piano. Mandated by Romantic composers' quest for greater power and dynamic range. We're always trying to improve and get louder louds and softer softs on the same instrument. Piano manufacturing eventually moved from the craft shop to the factory, so they were mass produced, and that meant that they could be cheaper, just like Henry Ford in his car. Piano manufacturing, I just said that. And a standardized instrument was developed that had a metal frame, so the strings could be cranked to a higher tension without breaking the wooden interior of the piano. And that they also improved the mechanical action, and they made the range of notes bigger. They put more on top and more on bottom. So we went from 5 octaves of available keys to more than 7. At the Parisian exhibition of 1867, 2 American manufacturers took away the top awards. Among them was Steinway, which, if you know anything about pianos, is still the creme de la creme. And they still make some of the world's finest pianos today. So short lyrical piano pieces called character pieces became very popular in the 19th century. And they had fanciful titles like prelude, intermezzo, meaning an interlude in the middle of things, and impromptu, meaning I just kind of made this up on the spur of the moment. Of course, they weren't really doing that. The nocturne, which was a night piece. Many composers produced keyboard versions of dances like the Polish mazurka and the Polonaise. Again, that was very much a Chopin thing. And the Viennese waltz, as well as the lively scherzo. So those were all dance forms that they took and they adapted and wrote piano pieces on the forms, but you wouldn't really dance to them because they're a little more complicated and they have that rubato in them. It makes it hard to dance when the music keeps speeding up and slowing down. They sometimes they chose more descriptive titles for character pieces that depict a mood or a theme, like The Wild Hunt, Little Bell, Forest Murmurs. Those are all pieces by the composer Franz Liszt. Here is George Sand. We talked about her before. Remember, she was actually a Baroness du Dupont, and she was a novelist, but she couldn't get her novels published under her own name because she was female. So she adopted the nom de plume, George Sand, so she could get her stuff published, and she and Chopin had a very intense relationship. Chopin was born outside Warsaw. His father was French and his mother was Polish, and he studied at the Conservatory of Warsaw, but in 1831 he moved to Paris and he lived there for the rest of his career. Paris in the 1830s was the epicenter of the new Romantic movement, and the circle in which Chopin found himself included the most famous composers, writers, and artists in France. So remember, Schubert had his little group of poets and novelists and artists, and so Chopin had one too, but his was in Paris. Although the virtuoso pianist Franz Liszt, the virtuoso pianist Franz Liszt, Chopin met the novelist George Sand, and they had a long relationship. They even got like tuberculosis together. That's the true mark of love. And in fact, Chopin died of tuberculosis at the age of 39. So none of these guys are living to be very old. The oldest one we've had so far was 56, and that was Schumann, and he was in an asylum at that time. Chopin's works are central to the pianist's repertory, and I agree with that. They include 4 epic ballades, a thoroughly romantic sonata in B flat minor and B minor, and 2 piano concertos. The nocturnes are melodic and meditative. The preludes are visionary fragments, and in the etudes, which crown the literature of the study piece, Chopin's piano technique is transformed into poetry. So here are his major works: 2 piano concertos, Piano music including 4 ballades, 3 sonatas, preludes, etudes, mazurkas, polonaises, scherzos, waltzes, impromptus, and nocturnes. Chamber music, all with piano, and some songs. His songs, the melody for the singer is not as good as the piano part. The piano part is fantastic. The sung part is just okay. 19th century composers who refined the short piano piece: Schubert, Chopin, Liszt, Felix Mendelssohn, Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel, Robert and Clara Schumann, and Brahms had inexhaustible ingenuity in exploring the technical resources of the piano itself and how expressive it could be. So we're going to hear the Revolutionary Etude by Chopin. Chopin's music is the heart of Romantic piano construction. It's the piano's golden age. His style is entirely his own. He does not sound like anyone else. He didn't try to sound like anyone else. His entire creative life, it revolved around the piano. And he is credited with originating many of the things that we do on piano now. We've talked about rubato, which remember is your code word. Rubato is borrowed time, robbed, rubato. Common in Romantic music, in which the performer hesitates here or hurries forward there, so that the beat is not as steady as it would be in, say, a classical symphony. You're not going to get the speeding up and slowing down there that you're going to get from rubato. And that's meant to reflect what's going on in the music, the romantic sensibility, the passion, the even panic. Sometimes depending on what's going on. So the robbed time in which certain liberties are taken by the performer without upsetting the basic pulse. Remember, it's just kind of like a stretch when you get out of bed in the morning. Chopin taught his students that the left hand should remain steady while the right hand melody would create the rubato. And you're going to hear that in the Revolutionary Etude. Let's see, what else should I say about this? So let's hear the Revolutionary. Remember that this is a reflection, we think, of his finding out that Poland had gone to war with Russia while he was elsewhere. And keep in mind that an etude is a teaching piece. So this is meant to teach a skill or 3. So here's what's going on in the left hand. Here's what's going on in the right. Everyone should know. I mean, A section get that. Page P. So perhaps this is looking forward, hoping that Poland is successful. Yeah. I'm not exactly sure what he's trying to teach, but I hope whoever it was learned that, because wow. Think for a moment about some of the Beethoven that we heard. You can really see and hear a direct line from Beethoven to Chopin. The fact that Beethoven was busting open those forms and making it possible to bend and break the rules makes something like that piece from Chopin possible. That left hand that just is constantly moving, constantly busy, constantly driving, and then the rubato in the right hand not sticking strictly to the basic beat and stretching it a little bit. That I hear a lot of I hear not similarity, but I hear heritage. I hear Beethoven's heritage coming through in what Chopin is writing. You're going to skip pencil and go on instead to Berlioz and talk about the program symphony. Now we know what a symphony is, and we know what program music is. This is a marriage of the two. We've had program music before, like Schubert's Earl King. We've had program music from Beethoven when he wrote his Pastoral Symphony, when he wrote his Eroica No. 3. That was music that was meant to evoke certain ideas and certain pictures in our mind. Berlioz takes it the next step, and he writes an entire symphony that's based on one musical idea and one literary subject idea. He calls it the Symphonie Fantastique, the Fantastic Symphony. Fantastic meaning not great, wonderful, good, but fantasy, sort of think of it as a Marvel movie. It's a Marvel movie. Many romantic composers cultivated program music, instrumental music with a literary or pictorial association supplied by the composer over absolute music. They wanted to convey certain stories, and some of these were nationalistic in origin, like when we get to Grieg, who we're actually not going to get to hear, and he writes Peer Gynt, that's based on a folk legend from his homeland. And that's all program music. It's meant to tell the story of Peer Gynt. The Nutcracker Suite is a series of dances that's very nationalistic in origin. Absolute music was music that did not tell a story. It was just music for music's sake. Hector Berlioz wrote the Symphonie Fantastique, which is a 5-movement program symphony. And it's unified by the recurring musical theme called the Idee Fix that represents the composer's beloved companion, but beloved partner. Music often evokes specific ideas or visual images, and that is at the heart of program music, that it was intentional. A title such as King Lear, which is another piece by Berlioz, for example, suggests specific characters and events, if you know the Shakespeare play King Lear, while Fleeting Pieces by Claire Schumann merely labels the mood or character of the work. Program music is distinguished from absolute music because absolute music has no literary, dramatic, or pictorial programs or associations. It's pure music. But program music is meant to tell a specific story. If you've ever seen The Sorcerer's Apprentice in Fantasia. That's a piece of program music. The story that they tell through the animation is the actual story that is meant to be told by that particular piece. There's some funky looking horns running around. Okay, so here we have here we have Berlioz conducting his bombastic orchestra, and they're so loud and so difficult to listen to that the audience is running away and holding their ears. I'm not sure that actually happened, but it's pretty funny to look at. So Berlioz wrote this symphony, which is his best-known programmatic symphony, when he was only 27, and he based it on a story from his personal life. These guys were falling in love all the time, and usually with people that they couldn't have or that they shouldn't have. And being, you know, romantic, the romantic sensibility of unrequited love, and I love that woman and I can't have that woman and I want her to love me, but she doesn't. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna go throw myself into the Rhine River. That was very much a romantic kind of sensibility. His score describes, and this is a quote from the score, a young musician of morbid sensibility and ardent imagination in lovesick despair, who has poisoned himself with opium. The drug is too weak to kill, but it plunges him into a heavy sleep accompanied by strange visions. The beloved one herself becomes for him a melody, a recurrent theme that haunts him everywhere. That's the Idée fixe. It's a series of notes that is meant to represent this woman that he's in love with, that he, you know, for whatever reason can't have. The Idée fixe is represented across all 5 movements of the symphony, but it's changed depending on what movement we're in. This is called thematic transformation, where you take the theme, the musical theme, and you change it, you vary it by the melodic outline or the harmonies or the rhythm. Sort of like a theme and variations, but the Idée fixe is shorter than a typical musical thematic idea. It's really just about 5 or 6 notes. The program of the symphony is as such. The first movement is called Reveries or Passions. The musician remembers the weariness of soul, the indefinable yearning he knew before meeting his beloved. Then the volcanic love with which she at once inspired him, his delirious suffering, his religious consolation. The second movement is a ball. Amid the tumult and excitement of a brilliant ball, he glimpses the loved one again. This time, the Idée fixe appears in waltz time, so like you're at a ball and you're dancing. The third movement is seen in the fields. On a summer evening in the country, he hears 2 shepherds piping, the pastoral duet, the quiet surroundings all unite to fill his heart with a long absent feeling of calm. But there she is again, she appears again, the Idée fixe. His heart contracts, painful foreboding fills his soul. The composer said that his aim in the pastoral movement was to establish a movement of sorrowful loneliness. Then there's the march to the scaffold, which I believe is what we're going to hear. He dreams that he has killed his beloved and that he has been condemned to die and is being led to the scaffold. At the very end, the fixed idea reappears for an instant, like a last thought of love interrupted by the fall of the blade. So he's getting his head chopped off because he dreams that he killed her. And then the 5th is the dream of a witch's Sabbath. He sees himself at a witch's Sabbath, surrounded by a host of fearsome spirits who have gathered for his funeral. There are unearthly groans, shrieks, and sounds of laughter. The melody of his beloved is heard, but it has lost its noble and reserved character. It has become a vulgar tune, a trivial and grotesque sound. It is she who comes to the infernal orgy. In other words, she has become a witch, and she joins the diabolical dance. We hear a burlesque of the Dies Irae. Remember the Dies Irae from last time? The song about the day of wrath. There's the witch's dance, and the Dies Irae are then combined into one. So let's hear about Berlioz here for just a minute. Berlioz was French. His father was a very well-to-do physician and wanted Berlioz to also be a physician, but the Romantic Revolution was brewing in Paris. And Berlioz was under the spell of artists like Victor Hugo and Eugene Delacroix. So he went off to Paris to follow his dream of studying music. He was a huge fan of Beethoven and of Shakespeare, to whose plays he was introduced by a visiting English troupe. Berlioz fell madly in love with an actress in this troupe, Harriet Smithson. She may actually be the inspiration for the Idée Fixe. We don't know for sure. In 1830, Berlioz won the coveted Prix de Rome, which was a composition prize, which gave him an opportunity to work in Italy. That same year, he composed the Symphonie Fantastique, which is his most celebrated work. After returning from Rome, he began a hectic courtship of Harriet Smithson, whom he married only to realize it was Shakespeare that he loved and not really Harriet. Oh, heartbreak. Berlioz's works show the favorite literary influences of the Romantic period. They draw on Goethe, Lord Byron, and especially Shakespeare, the source for his overture King Lear, and his opera Beatrice and Benedict, which is based on Much Ado About Nothing, and his dramatic symphony Romeo and Juliet. So he wrote many orchestral works, including overtures, which we have already been mentioned, choral works, including a Requiem Mass, 3 operas, including The Trojans, 9 works for solo piano or for solo voice and orchestra, and writings about music, including a treatise on orchestration. Remember, orchestration was the art of deciding which instrument would play which part. And that became a very important part of the Romantic symphony orchestra, was how do you assign this particular part of the song? Should it be the trumpets or should it be the flutes? So let's hear, I believe we're going to hear, we're going to hear March to the Scaffold and the Witch of Sabbath. Okay, so this is the March to the Scaffold. Remember, the Idée Fixe is going to come around at the end, at the very end, but he has dreamed in his opium induced sleep that he has killed this woman that he has this great love for, and he's been condemned to die. So this is his march to the scaffold to get to face the guillotine. So we're going to start off with this really ominous, low, rumbly drum beats and brass. Did you love their bassoons in this time period? Bassoons get some really cool parts in Romantic music. These are 80 peaks. Okay, so now we'll hear the fifth movement, which is the Dream of the Witches 7. You know, when you know the story that's being portrayed, you can kind of close your eyes and you can create images in your own mind as you listen, because it's very evocative, it's very programmatic. If it were not for the romantic composers, we would probably not have the kind of movie music that we have today. You can almost see the witches gathering. So there's our EA fix, but it sounds very different than it did before. Because remember, she has become one of the witches. This is going to lead us into the DFE ring. And this is based on an medieval chant for Dies Irae. So this takes us full circle back to when we were listening to monophonic chant. And this would be familiar to his listeners. They would know that tune. It's a long way from Joseph Haydn and his polite little symphonies. It's even a long way from Mozart. So the Dies Irae comes back again and sets us up for when we're going to put those two ideas together, the Witches' Dance and the Dies Irae together. Building, building. Grass. Both very reliable. Never lets you get completely comfortable. Okay, we're not going to talk about this in the context of the book, but I want to touch on leitmotif, what it is and how it was used. Another composer of this later in this era, Richard Wagner, German composer mainly of opera, invented what was called leitmotif. Leitmotif is a musical idea that's tagged onto a character in his operas. He wrote the Ring Cycle, and it takes something like 16 hours to perform the entire Ring Cycle. I mean, they're enormous, huge works. But this idea has continued to be used, that characters could be identified by a musical idea. So a composer of our modern era that does this kind of thing is John Williams, who's known for scoring many blockbuster movies, in particular for our purposes, Star Wars. And he uses leitmotifs to identify characters in the music that he is writing. You could probably watch Star Wars, never notice this, but it happens. And so let's hear a little bit about leitmotif.
Ain't touching athlete's foot.
Yeah, and athlete's foot, which is awesome.
Treatment.
Spectrum Mobile, your mobile speeds are already amazing fast, but now they've developed speed boost.
Whenever they talk about the Force or this associated closely with the character of Luke Skywalker, of heroism, of good. And whenever the Empire shows up or Darth Vader shows up, you hear the Imperial March. Now, of course, in the original trilogy, we didn't know for a long time that they were brother and sister. So this sounds a little much gushy, a little bit romantic, like they're sweet on each other, but now we know that. Oh, spoiler alert, in case you didn't know they were brother and sister. Now, this is from the more recent trilogies. And this is gonna be very lush, very sweeping. Because of course they're the star-crossed lovers. He's a Jedi, so he's not really supposed to be allowed to love, certainly not to marry and have children. She's high above his station. Look at that, those moving triplets in the baseline. That's very Chopin-esque. This particular one reminds me of another John Williams score for E.T., the extraterrestrial. Hopefully you've seen that movie. It sounds very similar in structure to the E.T. melody to me. And I think that's purely coincidental, but they are both kind of, green little alien guys. Kind of ponderous, played by lower voiced instruments, because Java is not really agile, shall we say. This is also called the love theme, because of course they're the big romance of the original trilogies. And they set up some things that happen in the later trilogy. And of course, you're going to expect the Emperor's theme to be very dark, because he's the major bad guy. Almost a Dies Irae kind of feeling. John Williams is the modern master of the idea of leitmotif. And so if you watch a Star Wars movie, you're going to hear these things woven into the score without even realizing it. You didn't know you were hearing it. You didn't know that your ear was being drawn to that. But if you watch a Star Wars movie in the next, month or so, you're going to hear that and you're going to think, aha, I know where that comes from. That's a leitmotif. That is a musical idea that's meant to attach to that particular character or that particular situation. And that comes down to us from the Romantic period when Richard Wagner was doing it. So it's much easier to show with Star Wars and a lot more enjoyable than Wagner. He is not really my cup of tea. Not really a Wagner fan, but I appreciate what he did with the leitmotif and it makes sense to me. So that is our very quick and not at all thorough cruise through the Romantic era. We're going to do some 20th century stuff next week. Again, just a glancing blow because we just don't have time to get in too deep. So for this week on InQuizitive, you should do chapters 39, 40, 41, and 43. I have put that on my Mac as a reminder to 39, 40, 41, and 43 for this week. And then next week we'll do some Romantic and we'll wrap it all up. So there will not be an era quiz for either Romantic or 20th century because we're not going to get to cover everything. So these chapter InQuisitives will serve as your quiz for what we have had time to do, if that makes sense. Next week I'm going to send you by email a list of whatever you're missing. So hopefully you can get that caught up before we run out of time. Remember that everything is due before Monday, because grades are due on Monday. So that's Monday the 22nd, not this coming Monday, but the next Monday. So I will send you a list of what you personally are missing so that you can kind of check it off and try to get it all done. If you are watching this recording, please remember to send me your code word by Monday so you can get credit for attendance. And if there are no questions or needed clarifications, I will see you next week. Remember that we do start later next week. We start at 7. You'll have all kinds of time to do lots of things.
Well, I'm coming up to chapter like 36 and the list.
Cool. Good deal.
Everything up to now is
Good to know.
today.
They see ya.
Yeah.
Annabelle, did you have any questions? Need anything? If not, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the Zoom.